Hello and welcome to the Brave Business Podcast, brought to you by the accounting, tax, audit and advisory firm Blick Rothenberg. Brave by name and brave by nature, this series is different. Aimed at entrepreneurial businesses, we focus on providing practical guidance, timely insights and professional opinions from industry experts, helping you make informed decisions for your business. I'm Declan Curry, journalist and broadcaster. Well, we are all global businesses now, especially when it comes to finding the best talent that we need for business success. So, how do we find, recruit, and retain that talent? What rules and regulations do we need to be aware of? And how does technology impact a global workforce? Sharing their insight and their experience in this fascinating subject, we have from Blick Rothenberg its head of global mobility, Rehana Earle, and from the law firm Bristows, partner Gareth Wadley. Welcome both of you to the discussion. Gareth, tell us what Bristows is. I said a law firm, but what does it do all day?
Sure, thanks, Declan. So, as you said, I'm a partner at Bristows, and I head up our employment and immigration practice. As a firm, our focus is very much on supporting organisations grow in dynamic sectors, particularly tech, particularly life science. My team specialise in both employment and immigration law, and we support organisations on all aspects of the employment relationship, from recruitment through employee relations to termination and beyond. And we use our dual employment immigration expertise in particular to provide practical strategic support on all of the legal issues that arise from international assignments, business travel, and the recruitment and retention of a global workforce.
Thank you. And Rehana, you're head of global mobility. What does that role involve and what do you and your team do?
So our global mobility practice supports international clients, so whether that's corporates who are sending people to work cross-border or high net worth individuals who have a international aspect to their roles as well, get all of the different sort of complexities of working internationally right. There's lots of regulations, we support with the tax side of that. We also support with kind of the reward and people angles that need to be considered. Again, all very important when it comes to thinking about a global workforce and how you sort of retain and attract that talent.
Okay, well, let's talk about how you build that global workforce, how you find it. First of all, how do you find talent in all corners of the world?
So I wish we had a really simple answer to that question, Declan, but actually it's quite a difficult conundrum to solve. And I mean, as we know, the world has changed hugely over the last few years, and driven just obviously by technological advances and the way we work and expectations and different generations in the workplace, etc. I think over the last, kind of 5 years in particular, global workforces have changed dramatically, because now what we have is a real ability to work with talent, not just in the kind of location where our office, if you even have an office these days, is based. So if you think about it, and this is the kind of how I think about it, when I started work, I'd come to the office every day. Pretty much everyone would live within an hour and a half commute. You get to work, you do your job. Whereas now, if I look at kind of a GMT time zone, for example, and I could recruit someone in Europe or in Africa, 2 to 3 hours time difference, to do a role that historically would have sat kind of in an office, in a location, etc. So I think there's loads of opportunity now to look at talent in a really different way, to recruit different talent, to create diversity in workforces purely by access to a whole different pool. And so that really gives us the opportunity to get on board different talent. But then how you retain it, or how you even attract it in the first place, I should say, and then how you retain it is a different question. And I think employers have to think really differently now about how they do that.
And we'll talk some more about the sort of specific technological challenges a bit later in the discussion. But just on that point, it has completely changed the game. It's a great liberation, isn't it, for companies? It means there's a greater pool of talent that they can now look at and usefully deploy.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's really exciting for organisations actually to be able to have access to that talent. It means they can get the best wherever they are based. But there's lots of things to think about that. I'm a tax person by heart, and Gareth obviously being a legal person, you have to make sure all of that is taken into consideration. But if you can get that bit right, actually, you do have access to a whole world of people that you didn't before.
And Gareth, you said your firm works with technology companies, and obviously that's at the vanguard of global talent. But it's not just tech firms. There's a whole range of industries for which global talent is now a runner.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the war on talent has gone international. And so if you want to compete with organisations within your sector, you've got to be tapping into that global market. And just to add to what Rehana said there, I don't think this isn't just about looking externally. Often the answers you'll find within your organisation, you'll already have the talent within your organisation. It's just not necessarily in the right place. And so increasingly we hear this concept of talent mobility, and actually either moving people to the right location to perform the job, or even in some cases, particularly where the individual or the skill set they have is acutely desired, you'll actually move the job to them. And we see that increasingly, but of course it comes with some complexities, which I'm sure we'll touch on shortly.
But actually that is a benefit for the talented person that you're trying to attract to your business if you're able to be flexible towards them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's not just an attraction; it's becoming a demand actually. And if individuals sort of know the value of the skills that they have, they can almost sort of set their expectations. And as a result, increasingly employers have got to respond to that and be a little bit more agile in terms of the way they go out and recruit.
Is this just a conversation for businesses that operate globally, or is it as relevant to a company that's entirely domestically focused here in the UK?
Absolutely. I mean, this for me is all about, as an organisation, attracting the brightest and the best people that you need to fill the particular roles
wherever they happen to be.
And if I put my immigration law hat on, it's so important to be mindful of the different immigration routes that continue to sort of be rolled out across various different jurisdictions, and understand how they can actually help your business.
Okay, so you've seen the talented person that you want to have working in your business. How do you attract them? How do you get their attention?
So I think employers now have to have a really good employee value proposition. I think before, obviously money talks, and having a competitive
in any language,
having a competitive remuneration is important, and you need to have fair and competitive remuneration. However, I think these days in particular, employees are just looking for so much more. They want to know that at every step of the journey of their career that they are going to be able to grow their skill set, that they're going to have the right benefits throughout that. They've got the opportunity to kind of upskill and have different opportunities. And so there's lots for organisations to think about now in terms of that. And I think the other thing is, and I sort of bring this kind of ESG bit in as well, I think people want to work for organisations who they align with from a values perspective. And so, it's not just as simple now as kind of putting a check on someone's desk and saying, like, here you are, this is what I'm going to pay you, come and work for me. There's lots of things that organisations need to think about.
And in some cases, that opportunity, that statement of ethical values, the flexibility that you can offer might be more valuable than the cash.
Yeah, and I think it all needs to be taken in combination, right? So you mentioned flexibility there, and I think, again, that is a really key part for many organisations now to be able to offer that flexibility to individuals. And also it creates the opportunity to get different types of talent in. As we mentioned, you don't necessarily need to be on the doorstep of where the office is now. So flexibility is an important talent attraction tool as well as a talent retention tool.
Is it as simple as just sending someone a message on LinkedIn and say, hey, do you fancy working with us?
No, I think it's far broader than that. I mean, I think what I'm saying, it might work. It might work, but it might work once in a blue moon. And I think what organisations need to do, and what I'm seeing and helping organisations do, is proactively evolve their recruitment and their talent strategy in response to the sort of shifting motivations that Rehana touched on, in response to technological developments. You can't stand still in terms of the way in which you recruit, and indeed the way in which you try to retain. As you said, remuneration it's important, but it's no longer the be all and end all. And without being too sort of age specific on it, millennials and Gen Z, all of the data coming out of the sort of surveys around that will cite flexibility, will cite almost sort of the morals and the culture, the purpose of the organisation, not just in terms of influencing which job they take or which employers they apply to. It will actually dictate and influence the career they decide to pursue in the first place. And the other thing, and I think you've touched on, and it's a kind of a recurring theme, because of our ageing population, we're in this sort of almost unique position where we've got 5 generations now active in the workplace. And of course, they have very different idea of what good looks like, and that is relevant in terms of your retention plan. Certain generations, it will be about stability and security. For others, it will be about being given the opportunity and being sort of given empowerment to actually sort of influence your career. And it's so important to adapt to that and not just get stuck in, well, this is how we've always done it.
Yeah.
And we're not prepared to change just for one candidate. I really think it's increasingly important to have a tailored experience for each candidate and then for each employee as they work through their careers.
That's a very, very good point. And one I was going to ask you is, how individual does the approach have to be when you're at that stage of making your business attractive? Is it bespoke and personalised, or is it a question of broader marketing, that you've got a good reputation, there's a buzz about you on Instagram or social media? What works?
I think it's a bit of both, actually. So you've got to have a good reputation, obviously, to be as being a good employer. But equally, it doesn't stop with just the sort of attracting someone in through the door. But it's difficult, I think, to make it completely individual. I don't think any business has got the capacity to individualise every single experience. But what you've got to do, I think, is offer that range and that flexibility throughout someone's career and their journey. So, a new graduate, for example, coming into our business will want very different things from someone who has been there for 20 years, who might have a family, who might, just have different kind of needs and requirements, or, and just be a different point in their career. And, to Gareth's point, I think it's that you've got to think about it in terms of offering that broad range of experience and opportunity to people in a very different way to the past, I think. So, yeah, I think it's a combination of both, but it will be difficult to make it completely individual.
And I think just to add to that, Declan, I think what we're seeing as well is, because the type of skills now needed to do roles is changing so dramatically, and it's in response to technological development, whereas in the past, individual sectors would be competing for the same pool of talent. What we're now seeing is a raft of different sectors competing for the same skill sets, digital skills, data analytical skills, computational skills, that in the past it might have just been one sector that was sort of going after particular skill sets. And as a result, you've got to be looking not just what your immediate competitors are doing, but a sort of, more across the broader piece.
So because we're all digital workers now, it's not just the IT industry looking for people with digital skills. Exactly that. But this also shows why it's those websites where your current colleagues or former colleagues can leave their reviews about what type of organisation you are and how straight dealing you are and all the rest of it, how important they are. That reputation really matters.
Yes, absolutely, because you're right. There are so many platforms now for employees to leave their views, what it's like to work, what is the culture of the organisation, what's the CEO like, so employees are advocates for businesses in a really different way, and it's very important to make sure that they are heard and listened to, and they understand the culture of the organisation, and they're bought into it as much as you are as the organisation.
A question you are free to not answer, because you may not want to answer. Without naming names, have either of you been approached as a talented individual. And even though it was an attractive package and all the rest of it, you said no because you just didn't like the vibe.
Do you want to answer that?
I'll happily answer that because it happens all the time, particularly in professional services. I'm sure Rehana would say the same. But certainly in the legal sector, the culture that exists in law firms varies dramatically from law firm to law firm. And certainly after doing 20 years of this, you've got a pretty good idea of what good looks like for me personally. And that will be completely different to my lawyer friend that I might, see down the road and ask them what good looks like for them. So that all feeds into that personalised experience. But it doesn't mean you necessarily have like-minded people across the business, and businesses thrive by having people that react and respond to things in different ways.
Okay, we talked about attracting people. Now, things like salary and values and all the rest of it are important for retaining them as well, and opportunity. But what are the new elements? When you're thinking about how you keep these people for the long term, what are the extra things that need to be considered?
So again, I think it's about the evolution of that person's career and the opportunities that come with that. A lot of it will be around upskilling and making sure that people feel that they still are providing, value in the business that they are working within, and that they have that opportunity for growth. I think that's a really, really important part of continuing a journey in a certain place. If you think about why people kind of leave their roles, yes, it might be for more money, but equally it's often because an employer is offering them an opportunity to do something that they don't have somewhere else. And so I think if you can create those kind of career opportunities for people, which include growth for them as an individual as well as for you as a business, then you will be in a much better position in terms of retaining that talent. And I think, for international organisations particularly, and we touched on this again, having the opportunity to have an international experience is becoming even more critical, actually, because, people kind of grow in that way. They want to see different cultures. They want to experience that. And it can be a really important part of your career journey. So I think having those different opportunities for people is going to be really, really important.
So making sure there are no dead ends, that it's a continuous opportunity for personal and professional improvement and fulfillment.
Yeah, particularly when it comes to your kind of really talented people, obviously, that you want to attain. And I think, don't forget that attrition is normal, and we shouldn't not have attrition, because attrition keeps businesses moving in a really positive way as well. But what you don't want to lose are your best people when they have got something really valuable to offer the business. So it's about thinking about that group of individual and even identifying those people, and probably identifying them quite early on as well, in terms of who are your key people, who do you want to have in the business for long term, how are you going to keep them motivated and engaged in what they're doing. So, it's having a talent strategy really throughout, and actually spending some time really thinking about that, rather than it being kind of knee-jerk, or someone saying, actually, I'm a bit bored now, I'm looking around, and then someone comes up with the opportunity for them. It's about proper planning.
So not waiting for it to get to a crisis point before considering. Is that harder to manage when it's a global and a remote workforce?
Yes. And interestingly, I was having a conversation with someone today, just this morning, who works in a fully remote environment. So she works for a tech company in the US, fully remote. And she was saying, actually, it's challenging, in terms of getting to know people in your business, those serendipity moments, etc. When an opportunity comes up, how are you the person that gets hold of that opportunity? And so I do think, even in a hybrid world as well as a fully remote world, it can be really, really difficult. And again, organisations need to be really purposeful about how they then make that happen. And when I was talking to Grace, it was this morning, she was saying, actually, having those touch points where they come together as a remote organisation, whether that's once or twice or 3 times a year, is really, really critical. So, retaining that culture in a completely remote environment is very important to retaining staff, because you need that interaction with people that you work with. You need that relationship to build and to feel like you want to stay somewhere because you've got those connections to people.
And it's one thing, if you've got a bustling sub office in Chicago or something, and there's 10 or 20 people there, and the boss flies over from the UK to see them on a regular basis. For a lot of companies, when you're talking about global talent, it might just be someone working from their home office who might from time to time feel like they're on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's probably more often going to be the case, certainly in terms of some of the organisations that we talk to, where we're helping them get that first person on the ground, for example, in a particular jurisdiction, or they're enabling people to work on a nomadic basis. And I just think there just needs to be an acceptance that the traditional ways of managing people and collaborating with people are no longer fit for purpose in that type of environment. And it's too easy just to look at your policies and procedures that will form part of your staff handbook and say, oh, well, let's just tweak those a little bit to make it work. I would suggest if you're really going to embrace global working and globally remote working, you've almost got to you've got to start again to a certain extent. And then, of course, policies are only good if people actually then live by them. And what you don't sort of pick up on is, and you touched on those sort of almost those sort of water cooler moments where you can't put a value on those, and indeed you can't sort of capture those in a policy. And so I think it's actually coaching and almost training employees and managers as to how you have to work differently if you're going to retain the kind of culture or the culture that you've aspired to get in the first place. Or you're going to say, we need to actually work towards a different culture. We're going to, because of A, B, and C.
Yeah, and that's a linked and important issue for many organisations, is how you maintain that culture of the organisation at arm's length.
Yeah. I mean, I think trust is really important in that cultural piece. So building trust. And I don't think that's just an employer's obligation to do that with the employee. I think it's a two-way street in terms of building trust, particularly in a remote or hybrid environment. So yes, as an employee, you want to be trusted to do your job, but equally as an employer, you want to trust your employees to do their job. And so, you know, if you're working in a remote environment, for example, people do need to be present. They do need to be available. They need to show that they are kind of there and they can be contacted. All these really basic things to sort of build that element of trust in that sort of environment. And similarly, you know, employers can't be too overbearing on employees. They need to trust them to deliver, and it's got to be about the productivity that they see, you know, versus, you know, the old school kind of in-person seat on bum on a seat type thing. So I do feel like when you're creating that sort of culture, a really, really important bit is trust. And if you can get that bit of trust right, and it's not easy, but if you can get it right, then you create an organisation with a good, positive culture.
I agree with that. And I think it's almost easier where you've got all employees doing the same thing. So they're either all on site or they're all remote. I think the challenge is where you get this sort of two-tier workforce where you've got some people working remotely or on a nomadic basis, and then you've got a core group on site, and it's very easy to have a sort of us and them type environment. Then you need to sort of build a bridge between those two separate groups.
And it is a challenge for, I don't know if it's a lot of managers, but certainly for traditional managers, those who regarded productivity as you say, counting the number of jackets on the backs of chairs. That doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work, but it's a gradual shift in mindset, isn't it? And the organisations that are probably embracing this the best are the ones that have actually invested time getting senior employee or manager buy-in to the approach that's going to be taken. And not just that, then actually, you know, the point I made earlier, they've got to be trained and coached how to manage people in a different way. We can't just assume that, you know, we click our fingers and we know how to do it. We sort of did it on the hoof during lockdown off the back of the pandemic, but we're now through that. And I think what organisations are doing now is the same. Well, we've had our sort of reactive policies. Now we need to work out what's right for our organisation in the long term, and that takes a lot more thought.
Looking at it the other way round, how do you stop the bigger group of workers in your main office from feeling resentment that the global talent is getting a lot of special favours, is being looked after in a much nicer, cuddlier way than they are?
For me, I see this, again, put my sort of employment law hat on. I see this as any other employee relations issues that an organisation needs to grapple with. And the best way to address employee relations or preempt employee relations issues is communication, communication, communication. You know, if employees understand why something is happening, they might not agree with it, but at least you've taken the time and the effort to explain it. And they feel that you are continually keeping it under review to make sure that it's fair, and to the extent possible or appropriate, there's a consistent approach. Then I think that just almost sort of takes the wind out of those sort of issues that tend to fester under the surface.
Because I saw somewhere recently that Italy was advertising itself to British workers as a place where you could come to Italy and have a lovely life and still do your job in Britain. If that doesn't stir resentment in the workers back at head office in the UK, then I don't know what will. Anyway, let's move on and talk about some of the other important considerations. Every territory around the world has its own rules and regulations and an approach to the workplace and its management. What are the key things you need to think about? We're not going to go through every nation, but give me some of the headlines.
I'll give you some headlines. I mean, I don't like to be the prophet of doom, the sort of lawyer on the panel that's going to tell you all the sort of we've talked about the exciting opportunity of doing some of these global talent initiatives, but to have a proper global talent strategy, it's complex and it's multidiscipline. It comes with a multitude of risks and challenges from a legal perspective, from a tax perspective, as Rehana will well know, regulatory, operational, and probably most importantly, a practical perspective. And so a multidiscipline view is required. Particularly the employment, the tax, and the immigration issues tend to be intertwined. And that's why, it's quite common for me to work alongside Rehana and her team to actually provide that sort of holistic view and holistic support.
What I'm taking from that is your broad message is don't try to do this on the hoof.
Well,
you need to know what you're talking about.
Dare I say it? It is worthwhile. Yeah, jokes aside, it is worthwhile speaking to people with the right expertise at quite an early stage in terms of your planning. So quite often, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Rehana, more often than not, actually, we're trying to unpick a situation where it's already happening. Yeah. And actually, if we said, look, if you came to us 6 months ago, we could have just talked through some of these issues and it would have been absolutely fine. And, just to give you a few headlines, so from Declan, in terms of the things I would say to clients straight away where they're looking to put someone into a new territory is, well, how do you intend to engage that worker? Are they going to be an employee? Are they going to be a worker? Are they going to be a self-employed contractor? Linked to that, what are the tax and social security, obligations and considerations arise from that? How do you intend to pay that worker? Are you going to need a local payroll in the relevant jurisdiction? What's the corporate tax position? If you put someone into a jurisdiction where you've got no corporate presence, are you inadvertently going to create some sort of permanent establishment for corporate tax purposes? How are you going to document these contractual arrangements? Is it an employment contract? Isn't it an assignment letter or something else? And which country's laws are going to apply? We can state which laws apply in the contract, but from an employment perspective, actually, that might be trumped by local mandatory employment rights and protections. Can the worker join a pension scheme? Can they stay in your existing benefit and insurance arrangements? And then looking at how do you protect business interests? How easy is it or not to enforce confidentiality obligations, intellectual property provisions, post-termination restrictions across borders? It's complex, and it often needs input from lawyers from across at least two jurisdictions. Don't even get me started on data protection. I'm not a data protection lawyer, but clearly, if you've got workers scattered around the world, you are going to be transferring their personal data from one country to the next,
and perhaps not just their data, but also the data of customers.
Absolutely. And so that's why I come back to. This is multidiscipline, and it's experts from a variety of fields that sort of need to feed in at a fairly early stage. So loads of issues to consider. I have to say I speak to a lot of organisations that sort of park this in the "it's too difficult for now" pile, and that's fine and that's understandable. But equally, if your competitors are not doing that, then you're potentially missing a trick. So at least understanding what's viable and how you might achieve it, I think, is worthwhile.
I remember in the dim and distant past that newsrooms used to talk about the difference between reporters who were sent out from London to foreign lands to report and people who were known as local hire, who lived and worked in the area. And the implication always was that it was simpler if it was local hire because you only had to worry about their rules. Is that right?
It can be simpler once you've decided that someone is a local hire and will be on a local employment contract, and you've familiarised yourself with what that means from an employment law perspective in terms of minimum requirements. But that in itself can be complicated, and sometimes it's worth looking at, well, what is the intention here? What does this actually look like in practice? Is this person actually, are they living there? Are they based there for the foreseeable future? Is it appropriate that they are employed locally versus someone who is just coming in on perhaps a short-term basis, and where a more sort of short-term assignment, sort of expat arrangement would work? And sometimes, you need to be careful of the sort of the tail wagging the dog. And the reason why Rehana and I will talk quite early is because I need to understand the tax position in order to properly advise my client on the employment and sometimes the immigration position, and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different ways of doing mobility globally these days as well. So, traditionally, as we know, it'd be like an assignment or a secondment somewhere. You get someone in to do that, and you move people around in that way. But it just isn't like that anymore. When I think of global mobility in the work that I do now, it consists of so many different types of global moves, global working. So whether that's, someone, a Brit who then, as you say, goes to work in Italy for a little period of time for their organisation, what does that look like versus someone who might move for a couple of years on a local basis, or someone that you might need for a project and you need to parachute them in for a period of time from the HQ. So it's really, really different kind of way of working these days. We have global nomads in a way that we didn't have before, etc. So when you're thinking about it, you're thinking about the regulations, the tax, the legal side of things. It is really complex, but you need to take into account all those different types of mobility these days. And
you need to keep it under review, because what regularly happens is someone goes overseas for a 3-month assignment and they're still there 3 years later. And you've got to constantly think, well, is the way that we documented and structured this engagement still fit for purpose?
So you can't bluff this, really.
Definitely not. I mean, for any organisation, whether that's an organisation that is scaling, for the first time, getting their first person in their first new market where they want to explore things, it's important, just as important to get that right, to be successful in that location, as it is for a more established business to understand the impact of mobile and cross-border workers, to them in a really different way. So it doesn't matter, I think, what size your organisation is. Global working is here to stay, and you need to make sure you understand at least the basics of the things that you need to think about.
There's also the changing political landscape, and in that, I imagine, we would include changing rules and approaches to immigration. We've seen it in this country in terms of British companies hiring people from Europe. Suddenly that changed. So that's another thing that I imagine you have to keep a monitor on.
Yeah, we do. And organisations should as well, to make the most of different schemes that are introduced across different countries. I think in the same way that companies and organisations are competing for talent, so are governments. And, many governments will look at the needs that they have, the skill shortages they've got, and the value that attracting talent can bring to their country, and they will create schemes around that. Migration tends to be obviously a sensitive political issue, and sometimes the country's general view or the government's general view on migration can have an indirect impact on their willingness to properly engage in thinking about what schemes and visa routes do we need right now, based on skills shortages, based on the value that talent can bring. And the other thing I'd say on that, Declan, is in the same way that we're saying organisations need to sort of develop strategies and evolve their strategies in response to the changes in the way we work and shifting motivations and technological changes, I think it's really important that work visa criteria starts to change, and I'm not really seeing that. I still think it's very sort of that sort of all the sort of traditional criteria that you see of can you work legally in this country still apply. But of course, the how, the where, the when we work has changed dramatically, as we've talked about. And I think we need to see something a bit more innovative around how we sort of structure our visa routes, both in the UK, but also, various countries around the world.
Has the global market for talent become a little bit chillier? Now we've seen more populist governments in Europe, in other parts of the world. Has that made global mobility a bit stickier?
I think there's always going to be a need and a demand for global mobility, because the best businesses will want the best talent wherever that may be required. And so I think from a business perspective, businesses, I think, should continue to put pressure on governments to make sure that they are taking those needs and considerations into account. Is it going to get harder? Potentially. More expensive, most likely, in terms of kind of getting people into locations. But I think we will continue to see mobility increase, because only businesses that have the right talent in the right place will succeed, and they will be demanding that.
I think what we will see is an increased challenge for countries to actually attract talent to their country, depending on the political developments in that country. And for example, countries where there is a populist movement, they might be less attractive to be a migrant in that country working in those countries. Equally, if I sort of dare I say it, we go back to sort of the implications of Brexit, and I look at how organisations now not just grapple with the fact that it's harder to tap into the EU talent pool, it's actually harder to attract EU nationals off the back of the decision to leave the EU.
When we look at the workforce and the talent that business might need, of course, there's a whole span of ages to choose from as well, especially as people are working longer in life than we might have done a generation ago. What issues arise from that intergenerational nature of the workforce?
So Declan, I think we're at a point where, we have people who were born in the 60s kind of in a job, and we also have people who were born in the 2000s potentially in the same workplace. And they have got very different wants, needs, requirements around, either the way they work or the work that they actually want to do. And so, as an employer, how do you think about kind of managing all of those different requirements? It's quite a tricky thing to do, but it's something that organisations really need to get their heads around if they're going to continue to have kind of a successful kind of workforce. So I think, again, it's coming back to that sort of flexibility piece, just in terms of your employee value proposition and your offering. What is it that a 20-year-old is going to want, and what is it that a 60-year-old is going to want, and how do you bridge that gap in terms of that?
But is this as blunt as thinking someone in their late 60s, early 70s might want to retire to Portugal, but they'll still do 2 days a week for you on a consulting basis? Someone in their 20s, haven't started a family yet, they can do a full-time role. Is it that explicit?
I don't think it's that simple, because you might still have, someone in their 60s who has different ambitions, but in a different way. They still want to be valued as an employee in terms of the work they do, and contribute in a way just as much as a person starting out in their career wants to do. So I don't think we're going to see people slipping away doing 2 days a week. That might happen, but I think it's recognising again that you need to find you need to find kind of training and upskilling and roles that will meet every different path of that career journey, whether you're just starting out or whether you're kind of at the tail end of your career. What is it that is going to keep that particular employee motivated in terms of what they're doing, and how do you enable that, and how do you engage employees within that? And it will look very different depending on where someone is in that career journey.
But does it look different depending on whether they're globally mobile or just in the home office? You could argue that all of that applies just as well to your standard workforce in your single office in the UK.
I think there will be a difference in terms of, a globe. Like, for example, if you do have a completely remote workforce, because again, it's probably just a little bit harder to sort of manage all of that. But actually what we might see is more people in their kind of, in the later stages of their career, as you said, going off to do other things, working part-time, but still providing a huge amount of value to an organisation. And I think, again, employers need to embrace that, see the value of that. They shouldn't be, necessarily putting people aside who are at the later stages of the career, because they've got a lot to offer. And if someone wants to go to Portugal and work from there for 2 days, is that going to work for you? And if so, and you're still going to get the value, and if so, how do you enable that to happen? I think it's really about embracing lots of different ways of working still.
And it comes back to the communication piece and properly listening to what your particular workers want, and not making assumptions about what you assume, what you think they will want. And one of the challenges I see is this sort of almost sort of lack of respect's the wrong word, but certainly a lack of empathy between perhaps different generations in terms of why they want to work in a particular way. And I think the more training or coaching around that to try and facilitate a better understanding and a better respect that actually there are different ways of working and they can all be equally as effective is particularly important.
What about technology? We realise, of course, that having the technology that allows us to work remotely, globally, is greatly liberating for the individual. It unlocks that global talent pool for the business as well. But as AI becomes a bigger and bigger part of business, how does that discussion change?
Well, I think new technologies have always created efficiencies and ultimately brought improvements to our personal and our working lives. And they've also impacted the way we work. I think it's quite rare to have something so seismic as the advent of AI in the workplace, and it's happened so quickly. And there's no question that there is this sort of pervading sense of concern as to how AI may impact the workplace. And if you think about it in the context of sort of your talent strategies or your recruitment and talent engagement, there is clearly scope for AI tools to enhance your recruitment processes, to enhance the experience for candidates, and indeed to enable you to go more global in your search more easily. Dare I say it, employment law hat on back on, there are a raft of issues in terms of using AI as a workplace tool, whether it's generative AI tools being used by employees or whether it's sort of HR tools being used by recruiters or employers. And that's the subject of a whole different podcast. Safe to say that human oversight will always be important. But I think it is inevitable that as these technologies develop, certain roles will no longer be required, or certain roles will need to be adapted and evolve. And that's what's causing a concern for employees. And that's what's causing a concern from trade unions and works councils and other sort of representative bodies. And I think the key here, again, dare I say it, communication. But I think employers need to identify when and how they engage with those stakeholders to ensure that where they are introducing technologies, that it's understood why they're being introduced and it's understood the advantages that can come from them.
I think if organisations don't embrace some of the technological advancement like AI, they might quickly find that they are behind their competitors. I think, as Gareth said, it has to be done in a really considered way. And when you're engaging with employees, you've got to be really clear on the purpose of it. But it is going to be such an embedded part of everyone's work, their life, etc. And I think everyone needs to get on board with it in the right way that works for them, but they need to do it in a way that is clear and helps people kind of understand what it means for them individually in terms of their roles in particular.
Does the use of new technologies like AI replace the urgency of finding talent, or does it magnify it? That actually you're now looking for a whole range of people with a whole range of different skills that you might not have had in your business before.
I definitely think it changes the landscape of the types of talent, and we will see more and more requirement and need for people with those technical and digital skills, because that is the kind of the future. But I put a little bit of a caveat on that, in that we are all human beings and we all generally like interaction with others, and those skills that are really important to doing business, in terms of engaging, in terms of relationships. No one is ever going to just do business with a piece of equipment or a chatbot. You want to have that kind of individual interaction. You want to build relationships with your clients. And for me, long-standing relationships with clients are built off the back of that. So I think AI is absolutely critical to kind of developing, and will require a different skill set and a different talent. But you will still need people who can, engage, who can talk to clients, who can give advice that they understand, and that is still going to be really, really important. So AI and all of that is not going to take over completely.
Does global mobility give you a more diverse workforce? And I mean diversity in its broadest sense, not just gender, orientation, community, but diversity of perspective, of thought.
Yes, absolutely. And, throughout my career, I have worked with people all around the world, to service clients, and having the ability to work with people with different perspectives, different ways of doing things, it brings fresh ideas and it brings innovation, actually. So, yes, I think when you're thinking about kind of global workforces, it's all about bringing different perspectives of the way that you do things, because those cultural nuances are really important, again, when you're sort of expanding your business, for example. So I was having a conversation again with a client who's kind of expanding into the US. So you might think US, UK, what's the difference? Vaguely similar. We speak the same language. We're a Western society. Much of what we do is pretty similar. But actually, the nuances in terms of how the US operate from a business perspective is very different. And likewise, inbound organisations to the UK. And that will be anywhere in the world. So, yes, I think, having a diverse workforce who understand all of those little kind of cultural nuances when you're trying to grow and expand in certain locations is really, really important to success.
And as we know from our previous podcasts on how to turn yourself into a global business, the big mistake is to think of the US as just one market. It is 50 different states, and they all have slightly different approaches and perspectives as well. Just try to sort of summing up this discussion. The big question in my head is it worth it? Given all that we've said about the complexities behind it in terms of regulation, in terms of employment rules, in terms of the impact on the culture, is the prize of that greater talent pool worth the effort required to get it?
I think if you look at really successful businesses and ones that are growing quickly, probably something that they have in common is a really diverse global workforce, getting the best talent from wherever that exists. So, yes, there are a lot of things to think about, a lot of regulations, a lot of, legal and tax, etc. But I think if you can, understand that and kind of manage that piece of it, then it's definitely worth it.
You're obviously going to say it's worth it, if only because it means more work for lawyers.
Well, what I would say is worthwhile, Declan, is at least doing the analysis and doing the thinking to work out whether or not it is worth it. for your business. And you can do this to different extents. And that's the point. But then you keep it under review, both with reference to the particular requirements of your business, the way technology is evolving, but probably most importantly, with one eye on what your competitors are doing. Because you can't go to sleep on the job in terms of this. You've got to find a way of making sure that you're keeping pace with the shop next door, as it were.
And that's the fundamental issue at the heart of this, is the vital importance of having the best talent for your business success.
Yeah. It's the number one thing up there, I think, in terms of business success, is having the right people to deliver that, because, you're not going to grow and you're not going to succeed without that. So thinking about how you do that in the best way for you as an organisation, and it's not going to be the same. There's no blueprint, Declan, here. This is how you do it. If you work in this country, or this is the size of your organisation, or this is your industry or sector specialism. It is very much about you as an organisation, what you need to achieve, how you need to do it, who you want, what your culture is. And if you can think about all of those types of things, then, you should be successful.
Thank you very much. Rehana, Earle of Blick Rothenberg, Gareth Wadley of Bristows. Fascinating discussion. Thank you both for being a part of it. And if you'd like to listen to other Brave Business episodes, you can find them on your favourite podcast service. Or there's more insight to help entrepreneurial businesses at Blick Rothenberg's Entrepreneurs Hub. That's www.blickrothenberg.com/entrepreneurs. I'm Declan Curry. This has been the Blick Rothenberg Brave Business podcast. Thank you so much for being part of our conversation.